Kulen Blat Gemara. Today's blot is Daf Lamed Aleph Amid Aleph. So continuing the discussion between Rabba and Abaye, why and Abaye comes to a suffixation, we say that you have to get chalitza. When it comes to a suffixation, Rabba says that a suffixation, if Tula the Chazaka said that she should not marry her brother-in-law, that even though it's a suffix, but she's divorced, not you don't marry your brother-in-law, nor do you make chalitza, because if you say chalitza, it'll be all kinds of problems. You rely on the Chazaka. The Chazaka is that she couldn't marry Shimon because she was the co-wife of an Arab. Whether the error was divorced or not, we're not sure. So Asia, by has a question that says, what happens? There was Reuben, Shimon, and later say Reuben and Shimon. Shimon's daughter was married to Reuben. Shimon's daughter was married to Reuben. So therefore, if Reuben dies, then obviously the daughter can marry Shimon and the co-wife is exempt. But what happened was that the daughter and Reuben died, and we're not sure who died first. Now, if the daughter died first, then the co-wife is Chayv and Yibum, because for a minute, she was the only wife of Reuben. But if Reuben died first and she was the co-wife of an Arab, then there's no Yibum. And what happened was, all of the house collapsed on him, on the daughter of Shimon. The Ein Yedu, and we don't know, we don't know who died first. So the law is, the law is that the co-wife doesn't know what to do, whether she has a mitzvah Yibum in this case, because maybe the daughter died first, or maybe she does not have a mitzvah Yibum because maybe she's the co-wife and Reuben is the one who died first. So we tell her, Safik, get chalitza, no get Yibum. Now, Amai, wanted to say here, leave things status quo. What was the status quo? That she was a co-wife of the daughter, and therefore she is exempt. If you leave things status quo, she should not go ahead with, of course, she cannot do Yibum. Status quo is that there's no mitzvah Yibum, but nor should she do chalitza, just like a get. Nor should she do chalitza, because the status quo says that you have no mitzvah Yibum here. And if you're going to allow her, by mistake, she'll go ahead and get married. Let's say each of the chesed sugarman, and this woman had no mitzvah yibum because she was a co-wife of the daughter of Shimon. Now you want to be machman and say her no, you have to give chalitza. You shouldn't do that because the problem can arise that what you tell her chalitza, she might give yibum, and she's not allowed to because the status quo was that she was a co-wife of the daughter. If you want to say, oh, we want to be machman and say you can't just walk out on the street and receive a chalitza. It's the problem you mentioned before. It's a problem because in this case here, if you're going to tell her go chalitza, she might think, oh, if you're telling me to go get chalitza, what are you really telling me? You're telling me is that probably the daughter died first, and the daughter died first. I have a mitzvah yibum. Let me get married. So the Gemara, why aren't we geyser? So the Gemara says the following: we don't generally make zaydas unless it's very commonplace. Geidish in the shchicha, divorces is very common. So gozer Rabban will geyser that mistakes can arise. Because if you tell her chalitza, she'll think that she's entitled to marry. But this incident of a house collapsing and both people perishing, like God, hardly ever happens. So therefore, the gozer Rabban, we decided not to intervene. It's a suffix, and therefore, because of the suffix, we're going to be machmer. And what do you call it? We're going to be machmer till the Yom Chalitza. Or inami, or gate, another possible logic is very simple. Gedishin the kaima erva. Everyone sees the erva is still alive. And yet we see that the co-wife is married, is doing a chalitza with Shimon. What do we think? We think that obviously the co-wife is divorced. The Chachami realized that the get was a valid get, and the Chacham worked it out, and therefore she's divorced, and that's why she's doing a chalitza. So they think, well, chalitza, let's do yibum. The kamuchach, it's obvious. But chalitza, yet why are you telling her co-wife to get chalitza? Amri, they'll say, the rabbis realize they get to the valid get, they get them out, it's a valid get, but people make a mistake and think, well, if you can do chalitza, if it's a yibum, why can't you marry? But Mapoilis, in the case of Mapoilis, everyone knows the story that a house collapsed and we don't know who died first. And Rashi says, you think the rabbis suddenly on the Vim and they know exactly what happened? Everyone realizes that the Rabban don't know, it's only a suffix. And therefore they'll understand, if we do chalitza, nobody's going to say, oh, let's get married. People realize that we don't know what happened and therefore we're just being machmer. So the Gemara, even by Gedushin, let me ask a question. Even by Gedushin, didn't we learn elsewhere that what now we learned? She was standing in the street, and he tossed a get at her. Kodav law, if the get fell closer to her, she's divorced. Kodav law, if the get is close to him, ain't the Megadesh is not divorced. Mechsa is right in the middle. We don't know. We can't measure, we don't know, so it's a suffix whether she's divorced or she's not divorced. So what do we say? What do you a suffix divorced? In what way? As follows. The kohen, if her husband was a kohen, he cannot take her back. Remember, a kohen cannot marry a divorcee, even if it's his own wife. And it's possible that she was divorced, he can't take her back. Absolutely, it's forbidden to him. the ervahi, and if it's an erva, and let's say if in the case where this wife was the sister, let's say it was Leah and she was married to Rachel, and you divorced, divorce is question was divorced. So Rasa, now what happens to the co-wife? Questionable whether she's divorced or not divorced. Clearly here that even by divorce, when we don't know what happened, it says you, Rabba said, by divorce, we don't know what happened. That's it. You go, we leave status quo. That is, until now, you were not allowed to marry the brother-in-law, so you go out free. You don't even need chalitza. And we don't want to give you chalitza because we're scared people make a mistake. If you need chalitza, they'll think that you're mama Yevamos. So we say, that's it. You don't need anything. And over here, it says clearly in the Mishnah here, if you don't know if she's divorced or not, the co-wife has to go through the motions of a chalitza. We don't say, that if you're going to allow her to take a chalitza, people make a mistake and also do yibum. Says the Gemara, Rabbi answers back. Allah, didn't we learn that Rabbi Yosef, I guess if Rabbi was talking to Abaye, he wouldn't have talked about it in third person. So maybe this is just Gemara discussing now with Abaye. So they both say, here's an interesting case. There's two possibilities. One is there's a suffix, we don't know what happened. There's a single lady who says this what happened, a single witness says that's what happened. Then you have a case, we have two sets of witnesses. One set of witnesses said this had happened, and another set of witnesses said this has happened. And the Gemara right now thinks there's a difference between the two cases. And it goes as follows. And here in this mission talking about there were two groups of Eidim. One group says, oh, definitely the get was closer to her, she's divorced. The other group said, no, definitely closer to him, she's not divorced. And they couldn't measure it because the wind came and blew it away or something. So now it's a suffix in the Torah. You have to, which way is it? Is she divorced or is she not divorced? So therefore, because it's a suffix in the Torah, you can no longer, whenever there's something in the Torah, you can right now the Gemara thinks when there's a suffix in the Torah, you can't just rely on the status quo. What bearing does that have on what happened right now? Just because yesterday this was, but we know that definitely changed. The question is, did it change halachically or not? And therefore, we would have thought, in this case, there's no status quo. It's a genuine suffix. That's why we tell the divorced woman, we tell the co-wife of the divorced woman, or the suffix divorced woman, go ahead and go chalitza, because a suffix in the Torah. Our mission is talking about bekatach. There's only one group. The havel is fake rabbanon. One guy said this is what happened, and one guy says this is what happened. When it's one against one, so therefore it's not a suffix Torah. It's only a suffix rabbanon. Suffix rabbanon. That's when we go according to status quo. That's how Rashi learns, and all the Rishonim have a problem with that. And if there's a suffix in the Torah, we also go status quo. What's the difference? Anyway, so thinking about it further, why do you decide that our mission is talking about a single witness? How do you know we're talking about a single witness here? One witness says this is what happened. One witness, maybe it's also talking about cases of 2 and 2. So Gemara says, "Do me kedushin." Ma kedushin, the kat achad. Kedushin was one group of Eidim, and one guy says it was close to her, one close to him. So Gittin also the same thing, 1 and 1. So the Gemara kedushin. How do you know that the case of kedushin, we're talking about one guy says I saw it closer to her, and one guy said I saw it closer to him. Maybe it's talking about 2 groups of Eidim. Deal with base kiti Eidim. Says the Gemara no, because even base kiti Eidim, because if there were 2 groups of Eidim, then why did you say that she only gets? No, it's questionable whether Reuven married the erba or not. If he married the erba, there's no yibum. If he didn't marry the erba, there is yibum. So we say get chalitza, no get yibum. If there were 2 groups of Eidim, tis yabim, the aim bekachklum. If there were 2 groups of Eidim, then we would say go ahead. The Gemara now changes his mind. The Gemara says if there are 2 groups of Eidim, we definitely go according to chazaka. The chazaka is that she is a yavama, that they wasn't married to the erba. She is a yavama. She should marry. The other, she should marry the brother. So why do you say only limited to chalitza? She should get married as well. Because they're standing 2 Eidim there, and it said cut of law. More says back, what are you talking about? You're telling me that how do I know it's one set of Eidim? Because with 2 set of Eidim, we would have said, so there's definitely one group of Eidim that says that she's not that she never was married because it was closer to him, never got married. So therefore, she should go ahead and yibum. On the contrary, there's another group of Eidim that says clearly that she is married and she's not allowed to get yibum. What are you telling me that she's been miyabim? Furthermore, by 2 groups of Eidim, you think because the 2 groups of Eidim suddenly becomes a suffix in the Torah. You know how we deal with 2 groups of Eidim? One guy says this happened, the other one says this not happened. It's called Eidei HaChosha. What do? We throw the entire testimony out. How do we know who to believe? We say they cancel each other out, as if there are no witnesses here. And what do you do in a case when there's a suffix, you have no witnesses? You look at status quo. So by Kedushin as well, look at status quo. And the woman should go back to status quo, and therefore she should be able to get married to Shimon. Where do you find something similar? A famous case, Nichse de Barshatya, the case of the Merksuvas we had there. The estate of Barshatya, he was a person, interesting name, because he was a person who, a schizophrenic. Sometimes he's very, very sane and in total control, and sometimes he lost himself. Interesting to call him Barshatya, I guess maybe from the source of the origin of the word is Shaita. When he's not in control of himself, any sale that he makes we don't treat it as a proper sale because we don't think he was totally in control of all his faculties. So he sold his property also by today. He sold it when he was well, and therefore it's a valid sale. But also by today, other two come along. He sold it when he was unwell, and therefore it's not a valid sale. What do you do? Is it a sale or is not a sale? Abash says, take the two sets of witnesses against each other, oppose each other, and say, cancel them out. And leave things status quo. So you see that even 2 against 2, we always leave things status quo. So the question goes back. So how come in the Mishnah by Gerushin it says clearly that if you don't know who's divorced, the Suffolk law, the co-wife should get chalitza, and your Rabbi said in our Mishnah, why do we mention kedushin not gittin? Because in our Mishnah would be a Suffolk. We would say, don't do anything, no yibum, no chalitza, because the status quo was that you were not allowed to marry your brother-in-law because you're the tzar of an error. What's the difference? So Bayi Difa says, I totally disagree with you, Rabbi. And he says, Elam Rabbi says, I believe there's no difference kedushin, there's no difference gerushin. In both cases, you do get chalitza, and you don't get married, just like the Mishnah says here. So how come our Mishnah here doesn't use that as an example? I'll tell you why. Because it's obvious. Once you gave that example by Kedushin, what do you have to give the same example by Gerushin? It's the same thing. Yagid Olabreya, let the friend talk about, reveal about him. Tani Bila Kedushin, the Mishnah gave an example by Kedushin, and but what did the same thing applies to Gerushin? Same thing applies to divorce. Tani by Gerushin, and it tells you the laws by Gerushin, who Kedushin. The 3 examples that the Mishnah does give by Gittin, that you wrote in your own handwriting, no witnesses, no date, 1 witness. Also, the same thing will apply to Kedushin. The Mishnah is just giving you different examples, but there's no difference between Gerushin and Kedushin. That's Abayi's view. Amalei Rabbi said no. I agree with you generally, but not exactly. If, let's say, that you tell me the same din applies by Kedushin, by Gerushin, why does the Mishnah say that this is Suffolk Gerushin? Does it say this and not, this is not a Suffolk Kedushin, only by Gerushin? So it's not exactly the same. What's the Mishnah trying to tell you? Which case only applies to Gittin and does not apply to Kedushin? Elamarav says rather. The same suffix that applies to Kedushin applies to Gittin, which is if it's questionable, if it's closer to him or closer to her. Same thing applies whether it's Gittin or Kedushin, and it's a suffix. Therefore, we say get chalitza and don't get Yibum. But however, Yesh Begerushin, there is a law by Gittin, Masha Enk Kedushin does not apply to Kedushin. And what is that? The Zeh, that is the Gerushin Lav Dafka. By Gittin, and what? That this is a suffix by Gerushin, but by suffix car of law, maybe it's not considered a suffix by Gerushin. So there are laws by Gerushin that you don't have by Kedushin, and when it says zehu, when it says the word this is the law by Gerushin, it's not necessarily, but by Kedushin, it says by Kedushin zehu. It says here by Kedushin, Zehu Suffolk Kedushin. This is Kedushin. In other words, that this case of Suffolk code of law, maybe does not apply to Gittin. So we use the same word Zehu by Gittin as well, but doesn't really mean anything, not coming to exclude anything. Says the Gemara, so what does Zehu of Kedushin coming to exclude? Since you're telling me that Kedushin and Gerushin have the same din, but Zehu, this case applies to Kedushin, and what doesn't apply to Kedushin? You're telling me that this is an example code of law, a question that's close to her, which also applies to Gittin, but this only applies to Kedushin, and not what? There's another example which applies to Gittin, but will not apply to Kedushin. Lemutes man, having a date. A get needs to have a date. Kedushin, if you don't have a date in the contract, it's all right. The lack of Kedushin, it's not so important by Kedushin. Why Taka, in fact, there's no date by a star by Kedushin? Why not? Says Gemara like this. In the Gemara, we're going to have Gittin 2 opinions why on a get must have a date. Why is it important to have a date? As long as she has a get in her hand, and you know she's divorced. Who cares when it started? Big difference. 2 ways possible. If there's no date, what happens if he's married to his niece and then she commits adultery and there were witnesses and she'd be killed and he has a chamanas on her, so he's going to backdate. He will say, oh, she's divorced. When that happened, she was already divorced. There's no date on the get. So we're worried that he's going to, and she really was a married woman. So therefore, we must put a date on the get. That's one possibility. The other one is whether the husband can eat the fruits of all her land that she brought, the property she brought into the marriage, until they're divorced. And if there's no date, he'll continue eating from it and saying, we weren't divorced yet. And she'll claim we were divorced a year already. And he said, there's no date on it. So therefore, we need a date. So he says like this. The one who said the reason is because the husband continues eating from the woman's property, even though he's not entitled to. Therefore, you don't need by kedushin, because when you're engaged, he has no rights to her property, so there's no worry. Arusa he has no rights to her property, so what are you worried about? We don't need a date. If it's because he has achmanas, he's married to his niece, and he's going to backdate it and say, look, she was divorced already before, so the same problem with kedushin. He's going to forward date it. If there's no date on the kedushin, he'll say, when she committed adultery, my niece, we weren't married yet. We didn't get engaged till a month later. So therefore, we should have a date in kedushin. What's the difference kedushin or gittin? Liskes mama from the ikad. As Gemara answers, you know why? From the ikad the mekadosh bekaspa. By gittin is only one way to sever your ties with a divorce. So therefore we have the rule of his man. Here you're going to make a takana to save her when it comes to shtar. But let's say it's with a ring. How are you going to stop him from lying to save her? He'll say, I gave the ring to her much later, or it's not, this isn't the ring, or whatever. So since it's not going to be fully protected, it's not fully going to do anything for this concern, so we just leave it alone. The ikad the more says, so some people get married through silver with money, and some people get married with a contract. Why make a takana when it's not a foolproof system? On the Rachel of Yosef, so what? But we find a precedent, let's say a slave. The ikad the kani bekaspa, the ikad b'shtar. When it comes to a slave, there's some people who buy a slave, purchase a slave with money. Some purchase a slave with a contract, and yet v'tikar rabbanan man. And over there we see that, like any other contract, a contract of sale must have a date on it. We need to know when the rights begin, because you own your Eved and you own everything that the Eved owns. The question is from when on in do you own it? So therefore, so we see clearly, even though how does that help in the case where you bought the Eved, purchased the Eved with money? It doesn't. But wherever you can. Says the Gemara knows a big difference. When it comes to an Eved, the vast majority of the sales are done with a contract. So therefore, it makes sense to put this law into place to protect the Eved. When it comes to kedushin, the vast majority of people actually use money. Very few people use a contract to get engaged. So therefore, there's no point in making a law to protect, to make sure that we follow the rules when it doesn't really achieve anything. Or another example, another answer possibly is, when it comes to kedushin, what are you going to do? You're going to have a contract, and we're worried that maybe he's going to try to protect us. And niece will say it came later. So we tell him, put a date. Where are you going to leave this contract? Think for a second. Hey, we'll give it to her possession. She's the one who got engaged. Here's a contract. If she commits adultery and she's caught, what she can do? She's going to erase she'll play around with the date and change the date. To backdate it, to forward date it so that she was a free girl at the time. She will erase it. Leave it by him, but it's his niece. Again, he'll also do that. Zimnin the basachos, it's his niece. And he will hide it, and he will want to protect it. The same thing, he'll play around with it. So there's no point in putting a date because they'll tamper with it. Leave it with the witnesses. They're a third party. Doesn't help. You know why? Because an interesting rule. It says we need to hear directly from the witness and not from what they record in writing. So if the Adim remember the date when they got married, then listen, they can testify regardless of what you write on the star. They'll say, we remember clearly he was married on Gimel listen. Although the Eli, if they don't remember, the only way they can remember is by looking at the star. It's not a valid edus. They'll see. We're worried that they're going to look at the star, come into Bezin and make a testimony, and that's called the peaks of them. They learned it from what they wrote. It's no good. But so therefore, there's no point in putting a date on the kedusha. So you saw by getting the same thing. Name a you say the same thing. So the Gemara says, no, there's a big difference. Hasam over there, over there, when it comes to get, she needs a get. She won't tamper with the get. She needs the get. If witnesses ever in the future come along and say that you're a married woman and you commit adultery, she needs to have a valid get to show that she is free. So there's no adultery whatsoever. So if she tampers with the get, then she has no proof that she is free and she's going to ruin her life. So she won't tamper with the get and she has the get. So therefore, it's all right. However, by kedushin, what's the worst thing going to happen? She'll hide the document, I was never married. So she's a free woman. So she's protecting, so not worried. Quickly, the next mission. Gimel Achin, 3 brothers. Nesuy and Gimel Nachis. Reuben, Shimon, Levi married to 3 unrelated sisters. The Meis Echem and one, let's say Reuben died. V'osaba Hasheni Maimer. So Shimon went ahead and gave her a kedushin. The Meis, and then now Shimon died. Because Shimon died, Shimon has his own wife that has to marry Levi. But now this woman here is straddling 2 husbands. She was Reuben's wife, but also partially Shimon. And you can't have one wife from 2 men. So what happens? So we say that both of them get a chalitza and not a yibum, because Shimon's original wife also only gets chalitza, because could be that she's married to Shimon, or she's partially married to Shimon, and you cannot get married to both of them. You can't give chalitza yibum to both of them, and they both get chalitza. It says the mace echad mehen. If one of them died, yibama yavalev. One man dies, the yibama has relations. Shalad mishalazi, because yavam echad only if there's one man tied to her. Now that 2 men tied to her. Now Shimon disagrees. He says, we had it before. I'm not sure what Maimer does. If Maimer consummates the marriage, then she's totally Shimon's. So therefore, if it's totally Shimon's, only one wife of Shimon gets married, another one is free. And if the Maimer did nothing, then she's Reuben's wife. Then she also needs, then both of them need a yibum. So this is what you do. You can marry either one, makes no difference. And then you give chalitza to the other one. You can't marry both because maybe they're both Shimon's wife. So you give chalitza to one and you give yibum to another one. So the Gemara of Ezik is based on that I said, if you're going to tell me that the bond, that as soon as Reuben died, she's already bonded to Shimon HaTorah, then chalitza nami like to buy, then there's definitely Shimon's wife. If you hold HaTorah, she's already considered Shimon's wife. Then even though they're 2 brothers, she's definitely Shimon's wife, 2 wives. Why even bother give a chalitza? Marry one, another one is free. The whole idea of bonding is only midrabanan, and the reason why we need both of them is because we are worried. Shema, why don't we let them get married? Then, if she technically is Reuben's wife, let marry Reuben's wife and Shimon's wife. We are worried that people who see that differently, they see her as being Shimon's wife. So people will say, Shimon's married to 2 women, and they're both now married to Levi. People make that mistake and think that you could, because they think that she's married to Shimon. So why the Rabbanan say you got to give chalitza to both? Let marry one of them, and the other one give chalitza to. So Gemara says, we're worried. People will think, people will think, well, they're both Shimon's wives, and this is what you're supposed to do. When a man has 2 wives, one gets married to the Yavam, the brother-in-law, and one receives a chalitza. The Yemru and those, Gemara says, who cares if they say that? The Yemru, what's wrong with giving a chalitza when you don't need to? So the worst thing will happen is one will marry, which is their din, and the other will get a chalitza. Big deal. So you're right. Either if he marries first one of the wives, and then he gives the second wife chalitza, who cares? Chalitza doesn't do anything. We're worried. First, you're going to give chalitza to one wife, and the moment you give chalitza to one, you completely severed your ties with your brother-in-law. You have no right to marry the other wife. And you have a problem. You'll be kash basha even the Torah says you decided you don't want to go ahead with the marriage because you gave chalitza. What are you marrying the other wife for? It's an Easter of your brother's wife. Once you decide not to build, you can no longer build. What about Nosan get lemamoroi? Let's say you gave a get, you decided to give an overture on the Mishnah says. So Shimon gave kedushin, let's say, to Reuben's wife, and then later on he gave her a get. He said, "You know what? I'm divorcing you. I don't want this kedushin I gave you. Let's forget about that." Is hutra tzarasa. Okay, so therefore, what happens is that she's no longer part of the equation. Let's say she was. So you can marry the tzara. It's no longer like 2 wives coming out of. You can't, if you gave a kedushin, you can't marry the other wife anymore. You can't marry 2 wives out of one man. But because you gave her a get to the kedushin you gave her, she's no longer she's no longer married to you. So now the 2 wives are standing in front of you. I can choose the other one. Avol he asuda, but she herself, you should no longer marry because he gave her a get. Why? The mechel bal's get. People might think that in the future, that if you gave a get, you've completely severed your ties. And they'll think that what? If you, let's say there's a woman there, your brother died, and has a woman, you went ahead and gave her a get, they'll think that that's it, that you're no longer married. There's no longer a yibum. So therefore, the best thing is you married the other wife. You could say, if you gave a get to her, hutra, everyone is permitted. Why? Because all you achieved by the get was that which I changed before, I'm removing it now. My time and my da'ava b'shak, I'm moving it now. I'm back to square one, which is that both women are available to me, and I can choose whichever one I want. Okay, we'll stop here. Have a good Chodesh.